And as we discuss foreign policy, I know that all of you share with me your shock and your horror at what happened in Paris, and you share with me your condolences for the families who lost loved ones and your hopes and prayers that those who were wounded will recover. And also those same thoughts go out to the families of those who lost loved ones in the Russian flight that we believe was taken down by an ISIS bomb, and also those who lost their lives to terrorist attacks in Lebanon and elsewhere. To my mind, it is clear that the United States must pursue policies to destroy the brutal and barbaric ISIS regime and to create conditions that prevent fanatical extremist ideologies from flourishing. But we cannot and should not do it alone. Our response must begin with an understanding of past mistakes and missteps in our previous approaches to foreign policy. It begins with the acknowledgement that unilateral military action should be a last resort, not a first resort. And that ill-conceived military decisions such as the invasion of Iraq can wreak far-reaching devastation and destabilization over regions for decades. It begins with the reflection that the failed policy decisions of the past, rushing to war, regime change in Iraq, or toppling Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. Mossadegh was the president. CIA and others got rid of him to protect British petroleum interests. The Shah of Iran came in, a brutal dictator, and he was thrown out by the Islamic Revolution, and that is where we are in Iran today. Decisions have consequences, often unintended consequences. So whether it was Saddam Hussein or Mossadegh or Guatemalan President Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala, Brazilian President Goulart in 1964, Chilean President Allende in 1973, this type of regime change, this type of overthrowing governments we may not like, often does not work, often makes a bad and difficult decision even worse. These are lessons we must learn. After World War II, in response to the fear of Soviet aggression, European nations and the United States established NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, an organization based on shared interest and goals and the notion of a collective defense against a common enemy. It is my belief that we must expand on these ideals and solidify our commitments to work together to combat the global threat of terror. We must create a new organization like NATO to confront the security threats of the 21st century, an organization that emphasizes cooperation and collaboration to defeat the rise of violent extremism and, importantly, to address the root causes underlying these brutal acts. We must work with our NATO partners. We must work to expand the coalition with Russia, and we must work with members of the Arab League. But let us be very clear. While the United States and other Western nations have the strength of our militaries and our political systems, the fight against ISIS is a struggle for the soul of Islam, and countering violent extremism and destroying ISIS must be done primarily by Muslim nations with the strong support of their global partners. Now, this has been my view long before Paris, but I am very happy to tell you that these same sentiments have been echoed by people like Jordan's King Abdullah II in a speech just Sunday, in which he said that terrorism is the greatest threat to our region, the Gulf region, Middle East, and that Muslims must lead the fight against it. He noted that confronting extremism is both a regional and international responsibility, and that it is incumbent on Muslim nations and communities to confront those who seek to hijack their societies and their religion with generations of intolerance and violent ideology. And let me congratulate King Abdullah not only for his wise remarks, but also for the role that his small country is playing in attempting to address the horrific refugee crisis in that region. A new and strong coalition of Western powers, Muslim nations, and countries like Russia must come together in a strongly coordinated way to combat ISIS, to seal the borders that fighters are currently flowing across, to share counterterrorism intelligence, to turn off the spigot of terrorist financing, and to end support for exporting extremist ideologies. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that in many cases, we must ask more from those countries in the Gulf region. While Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, and Lebanon, in their own ways, have accepted their responsibilities for taking in Syrian refugees, other countries in the region have done nothing or very little. Equally important, and this is a point that may make some people uncomfortable, but it is a point that must be made. Countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, countries of enormous wealth and resources, have contributed far too little in the fight against ISIS. That must change. King Abdullah is absolutely right when he says that the Muslim nations must lead the fight against ISIS, and that includes and must include some of the most wealthy and powerful nations in the region who, up to this point, have done far too little. Saudi Arabia, turns out, has the third largest defense budget in the world. Yet instead of fighting ISIS, they have focused more on a campaign to oust Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. Kuwait, a country whose ruling family was restored to power by the United States driving Saddam Hussein's Iraq out of Kuwait, has been a well-known people in Kuwait have been well-known sources of financing for ISIS and other violent extremists. It has been reported that Qatar will spend up to $200 billion on the 2022 World Cup, including the construction of an enormous number of facilities to host that event. $200 billion on hosting a soccer event, yet very little to fight ISIS. Worse still, it has been widely reported that the government there has not been vigilant in stemming the flow of terrorist financing, and that Qatari individuals and organizations funnel money to some of the most extreme terrorist groups in the region. All of this has got to change. Wealthy and powerful Muslim nations in the region can no longer sit on the sidelines and expect the United States, our young men and women, and our taxpayers to do it for them. They have got to come up to the plate. As we develop a strongly coordinated effort, we need a commitment from these countries that the fight against ISIS takes precedence over the religious and ideological differences that hamper the kind of cooperation that we desperately need. Further, we all understand that Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, is a brutal dictator who has slaughtered many of his own people. I am pleased that we saw last weekend diplomats from all over the world, known as the International Syria Support Group, set a timetable for a Syrian-led political transition with an open and fair election. These are the promising beginnings of a collective effort to end the bloodshed and move toward a political transition in Syria. The diplomatic plan for Assad's transition from power is a good step in a united front. But our major priority must be to defeat ISIS. Nations all over the world who share a common interest in protecting themselves against international terrorism must make the destruction of ISIS the highest priority. Nations in the region must commit that instead of turning a blind eye, they will commit their resources to preventing the free flow of terrorist finances and fighters to Syria and Iraq. We need a commitment that they will counter the violent rhetoric that fuels terrorism, rhetoric that often occurs within their very borders. This is the model which we must pursue in order to address the global threats that we face. While individual nations obviously have historic disputes, the United States and Russia now have very strong differences of opinion on some very serious issues. Iran and Saudi Arabia, to put it mildly, do not like each other. But the time is now to do everything possible to put aside those differences to work toward a common goal of destroying ISIS. Sadly, as we have seen recently, no country is immune from attacks by the violent organization called ISIS. Thus, we must work with our partners in Europe, the Gulf region, Africa, and Southeast Asia, all along the way, asking the hard questions whether their actions are serving our unified purpose. The bottom line is that ISIS must be destroyed, but it cannot be defeated by the United States alone.